It was just past sunset at Frogmore Cottage when the first ripples of the storm arrived, not in thunder or lightning, but in the form of a sealed envelope, stamped with the royal arms, and delivered in silence. There was no warning, no phone call, no whisper of what was about to unfold. Inside, Prince Harry would find words that cut deeper than any public headline, more final than any televised fallout. It was official. His name had been removed from the royal succession list. The throne, a birthright that once seemed inevitable, even if far away, was no longer his to dream of. Not by accident, not by resignation, but by decision. A deliberate, coordinated act approved by King Charles and supported by 24 of Britain's most powerful and ancient dukes. The monarchy had spoken, and the silence that followed was deafening. Prince Harry, once dubbed the People's Prince, had become something else entirely. A figure wrapped in controversy, rebellion, and miscalculated moves. But no matter how far he moved from the palace gates, from the gilded corridors of Buckingham, from the shadow of his older brother, he had never truly expected the institution to erase him. Not like this. Not formally. Not legally. And certainly not with the full weight of the royal peerage standing behind it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But this wasn't just a story about royal protocol or birthright politics. It was a story of betrayal, heartbreak, calculated revenge, and centuries-old codes clashing with modern disobedience. At the center of it all stood a man who had given up his title's duties for freedom, who had walked away with conviction but now stood shattered in the aftermath of a quiet war, a war he might have thought he was winning. Until now. So what happened? How did the youngest son of King Charles III, the beloved child of Princess Diana, find himself struck from the very list that once guaranteed his place in history? Why did the royal establishment, after years of strained tolerance, finally pull the plug? And why now? Was this about Harry's controversial interviews, the Netflix specials, the accusations leveled in his memoirs, or something far more hidden, more treacherous, something the public never saw coming? This is the story of a monarchy pushed to its limits. A family torn between tradition and turmoil. A father forced to choose between the integrity of the crown and the love of his son. And a prince who believed, even in his defiance, that the door to home would always remain open, until the locks were changed. But before we pull back the curtain on the decision made within the palace walls, we must first revisit the road that brought Prince Harry here. Because this wasn't a single moment of exile. It was a slow burn, a winding descent into isolation paved with media wars, whispered resentment, and moments of shattered trust. And at every turn, Harry believed he was fighting for something greater, for autonomy, for truth, for a new legacy built on his own terms. In the years following his departure from royal life, Harry transformed himself into an international figure of activism and celebrity, often in ways that challenged the very institution that raised him. The interviews were bold. The revelations were explosive. Mental health struggles, accusations of racism, tales of palace cruelty. Harry and Meghan held nothing back. To some, they were brave. To others, they were reckless. But inside the royal chambers, the walls were beginning to shake. King Charles, newly ascended after the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, was already walking a delicate line. He inherited not just the crown, but the task of redefining the monarchy in an age of global skepticism. With scandals circling from all corners, from Prince Andrew's disgrace to Camilla's controversial rise to queen, Charles faced a monarchy on the edge of cultural relevance. And in that volatile landscape, one question grew louder each day. Could Harry still be trusted with a place in the royal future? The answer, it turns out, came not in an outburst but in strategy. Quiet meetings were held. Documents reviewed. A circle of dukes, men whose families had served the crown since medieval times, were summoned, their allegiance to the throne unquestionable. These were not politicians or media consultants. They were custodians of tradition, bearers of titles that predated Parliament itself. And what they advised, reportedly, was as brutal as it was clear. Remove him. Not symbolically, not informally. Remove him from the list. Make it real. The decision required more than just Charles's signature. It required the consensus of royal law experts, consultation with the Privy Council, and a nod from the House of Lords. And according to insiders, the most startling part wasn't that it happened, but how quickly it all moved once the order was given. The papers were prepared. The peers were informed. The world, meanwhile, had no idea what was coming until Harry received the letter. Witnesses close to the Sussex household described the moment as surreal. Harry opened the envelope alone. He read the document twice. At first, he was motionless. Then came a tremble. Then silence. And then, without warning, the man who once fought Taliban forces in Afghanistan collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. No shouting. No tantrum. Just grief. It was a grief only a few could understand. Because no matter how complicated his relationship with the institution had become, the removal from the line of succession wasn't just a formality. It was a statement. One that would echo through the rest of his life. He was no longer a spare. Not by title. Not by law. He was a man without a kingdom. A prince, now purely by blood. Not by duty, not by legacy, not by right. But if the story ended there, it wouldn't be enough. Because what followed was a chain reaction that revealed even deeper fractures within the House of Windsor. Meghan's reaction behind closed doors reportedly stunned even Harry. King Charles's cold detachment in the aftermath only deepened the wound. And Prince William? Sources say his silence was more piercing than any rebuke. This wasn't just about a succession list. It was about a family choosing the crown over connection. About ancient traditions clashing violently with modern rebellion. About what happens when you challenge an empire and think your blood will shield you. But blood, in this case, wasn't enough. Not anymore. The stage is set. The throne remains intact. But one prince now stands in its shadow, not as heir or spare, but as a ghost of what could have been. And the question we'll be exploring next is as haunting as the silence that followed Harry's fall. What exactly pushed King Charles and the 24 dukes to such a final, ruthless decision? Was it politics? Pride? Or a secret betrayal yet to be revealed? The answers are as shocking as they are heartbreaking. The story of the British monarchy is steeped in centuries of tradition, law, and unyielding protocol. It is an institution that stands not only as a symbol of continuity, but as a living embodiment of the British state itself. And at the very heart of that institution lies one immutable concept, the royal line of succession. It is not just a list of names. It is a sacred roadmap that determines the future of the crown. And for much of his life, Prince Harry held a place on that map, secured by birth, honored by blood, and sheltered under the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. But as of now, that place has been erased. To understand the gravity of such a move, one that stunned even seasoned royal watchers, we must first journey into the very mechanics of royal succession. Because once you understand what it takes to be on that list, you begin to grasp what it truly means to be removed from it. This chapter is not about drama or speculation. It is about royal law, royal lineage, and the deeply embedded architecture of power that governs Britain's constitutional monarchy. In its most basic form, the line of succession is the ordered list of individuals eligible to inherit the British throne. It is based primarily on descent, legitimacy, religion, and parliamentary law. At present, it is governed by several key legal frameworks, most notably the Act of Settlement 1701, the Royal Marriages Act 1772, the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, and interpretations of common law traditions that have been shaped over generations. The current succession begins, of course, with King Charles III. His heir is Prince William, the Prince of Wales, followed by William's children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. Prince Harry, once third in line at birth, had remained fifth in line for many years, even after stepping down from his senior royal duties. Despite moving to the United States, despite the explosive interviews, and despite the public fallout, his position in the line remained legally untouched until now. That reality made what happened all the more shocking. Because by removing Harry from the succession, the monarchy didn't just issue a reprimand. They changed the very future of the royal lineage. And such a move could not, have been done lightly. You see, the royal succession is not something that can be altered with a passing whim. There is no delete button. The list is entrenched in constitutional authority, and any major adjustment, especially one involving a direct descendant of the reigning monarch, requires coordination between the crown, legal advisors, and often, parliamentary consultation. This isn't just a family affair. It is a constitutional matter with political, legal, and symbolic consequences. So why did it happen? To understand the build-up, we must rewind to the origins of the royal succession list and its modern relevance. Long gone are the days when royal succession was decided on battlefields or behind palace doors with whispered conspiracies and poison-tipped letters. In the 21st century, succession is a matter of public record, enshrined in transparent legal statutes. But even in this modern context, one thing remains unchanged: the idea that those in the line of succession represent not just people, but potential monarchs. They are the heirs to a 1,000-year-old legacy, with every expectation of decorum, loyalty, and responsibility. And Prince Harry, according to critics within the establishment, violated all three. One of the foundational concepts of royal succession is legitimacy, not just in terms of birthright, although that plays a significant role, but in behavior. A future monarch, or someone in line to be one, must be seen as a custodian of the crown's dignity and values. The moment those values are seen to be jeopardized, the pressure to remove that individual from the line begins to mount. In Harry's case, that pressure had been building for years. It began, some say, with the 2020 Megxit announcement. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex, via Instagram, declared their decision to step back from senior royal duties. It was unprecedented, a royal first, and the shockwaves it created within the palace were immediate. But even then, the Queen chose diplomacy over discipline. Harry was given a grace period, a form of institutional leniency. He remained on the succession list, and the door, metaphorically, at least, remained ajar. But that leniency eroded with each passing year. As the couple launched a string of media ventures, from high-profile interviews to podcasts, Netflix specials, and Harry's explosive memoir, the institution found itself under siege. Allegations of racism, claims of coldness, portrayals of royal life as toxic and outdated. For the public, it was gripping. For the monarchy, it was existentially threatening. And still, Harry's name remained on the list. Behind closed doors, however, a different conversation was brewing. According to palace insiders, the question was no longer, can we tolerate this, but can we risk what this means if we don't act? The crown was at a crossroads. Should they continue allowing a prince living in California, no longer bound by royal protocols, using his title for global influence, to remain in line for the throne? What message did that send? What precedent did that set? The stakes were high. And the answer, when it finally came, was definitive. Now, to understand how such a decision could be made, one must understand the roles of the hereditary dukes in the broader royal structure. These are not ceremonial figures. The 24 non-royal hereditary dukes of the United Kingdom represent some of the oldest titles in the realm. Many of their families date back to the Plantagenet era. They have served kings and queens for centuries, often as advisors, military leaders, and political anchors. Though their power today is symbolic in many ways, their loyalty and influence remain unmatched. When King Charles sought their counsel, or perhaps simply informed them of the plan, their agreement was almost universal. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the survival of the monarchy itself. And so, with a combination of historical precedent and modern legal authority, the process began. Removing someone from the succession list does not necessarily mean removing their royal title. Prince Harry still holds the title Duke of Sussex, at least for now. But the act of removal is more profound than a name change. It is a revocation of future possibility, a declaration that the individual in question no longer carries even a remote claim to the throne. There is no public ceremony for such an act, no televised press conference. It is done behind closed doors, with sealed documents, countersigned advisories, and carefully worded communications. But the consequences echo across generations. The future maps of the monarchy, the ones studied by royal watchers and constitutional scholars, will now have a blank space where Harry's name once sat. And for Harry, it is a loss that cannot be undone. Unlike resigning from royal duties, which was a choice, this removal was not his decision. It was imposed. It was final. But what are the deeper implications of such a move? For starters, it casts a long shadow over his children, Archie and Lilibet, whose place in the royal hierarchy becomes even murkier. Though they were granted titles in 2023, the removal of their father from the succession list throws their own standing into question. Are they still considered royals by birthright? Or does the act of removal sever that lineage? It also signals a profound shift in how the monarchy intends to navigate the 21st century. By removing Harry, the institution is sending a clear message to the world that titles alone are not enough, that behavior matters, that loyalty matters, and that the crown, even in modern times, will not hesitate to protect itself from those it deems a threat. And finally, it opens the door to a broader reckoning. If Harry can be removed, who else might be next? Could this set a precedent for future purges of controversial royals? Or is this a one-time act, a calculated strike against the son who went too far? These are the questions swirling in the aftermath, and they are only the beginning. What comes next is a deeper dive into the personal, political, and emotional dominoes that this decision set into motion. Because this was not the end of Harry's story. It was the moment the real battle began. The battle for legacy, for reputation, and for redemption. There was a time when Prince Harry wasn't the black sheep of the royal family. Long before the whispers of exile and succession lists, he was the golden boy, cheeky, daring, rebellious in the charming way, but never in a way that truly threatened the crown. The world adored him. Britain loved him. And the monarchy relied on his energy, his connection with the public, to keep the institution human, relatable, and vibrant. He was the prince who laughed with children at hospitals, the one who danced with orphans in Lesotho, who served with courage in Afghanistan. He was Diana's son, and her spirit lived on in him in ways the public found deeply comforting. Unlike his older brother, who was being groomed for the throne from birth and lived under the weight of rigid expectations, Harry was free to be himself. And for a time, that worked beautifully. But freedom, in the royal world, only stretches so far. The first cracks in the image began to show long before Meghan Markle entered the frame. Harry's struggles with the paparazzi, his anger at the media's treatment of his mother, and his frequent clashes with the press had already made him a complicated figure inside palace circles. He was a man burdened with trauma that the institution was ill-equipped to address. And yet, instead of receiving support, he was often reminded of his place, second to his brother, third in importance, and always expected to keep his grievances behind closed doors. Then came the parties, the drinking, the headlines that embarrassed the crown. The infamous Nazi costume at a private party in 2005. The strip poker incident in Las Vegas in 2012. These were moments the public could forgive. Youthful missteps, they said, but inside Buckingham Palace, they were taken more seriously. They were documented, remembered, and they began to form a file, not just literal, but reputational. Still, Harry retained his place, because beneath the missteps was still a prince loved by the people. The turning point came not with a scandal, but with a love story. In 2016, the world learned that Prince Harry was dating Meghan Markle, an American actress, biracial, divorced, and outspoken. The media coverage was immediate, intense, and often vicious. Meghan was portrayed as too ambitious, too Hollywood, too American for the ancient and stoic ways of British royalty. The palace was rattled not by the woman herself, but by how Harry responded to the backlash. He didn't ask permission before releasing a public statement condemning the racist and sexist treatment Meghan was receiving in the press. He didn't consult palace communications before breaking royal protocol. He acted from the heart, something Diana might have done, and in doing so, he drew a line in the sand. From that point forward, Harry became a rogue agent within the firm. He and Meghan's relationship progressed quickly. Their 2017 engagement was celebrated publicly, but behind the scenes, concerns reportedly began to fester. Meghan was independent, media-savvy, and had a voice she didn't intend to silence. She asked questions about royal traditions. She wanted change, not in the abstract, but in the day-to-day operations of their roles. This was not how royal spouses were supposed to behave. Their 2018 wedding at St. George's Chapel was a global event, joyful, multicultural, and modern. It was watched by millions and seen by many as a hopeful moment for a new monarchy. But the optimism didn't last. Stories began to leak about tensions between Meghan and palace staff. Reports of a feud between Meghan and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, began to circulate. The tabloids fed on it. The press narrative turned, and the palace's silence, in Meghan and Harry's eyes, was complicit. By 2019, the couple had become increasingly isolated from the rest of the royal family. Public engagements felt forced. The joy had drained from their expressions. And during a tour in Africa, in what was supposed to be a celebratory documentary, Harry confessed that he and William were on different paths. Meghan, in an emotional moment, thanked the interviewer for simply a skin. These weren't just sound bites. They were warnings. Then came the bombshell, January 2020. Via Instagram, Harry and Meghan announced they would step back from senior royal duties, seek financial independence, and split their time between North America and the UK. The post sent shockwaves through the monarchy. It wasn't the departure itself that was so jarring, it was the way it was done. Publicly, unilaterally, without palace approval. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Queen Elizabeth summoned Harry, William, and Charles to what the media dubbed the Sandringham Summit. It was there, in a tense family meeting, that the Queen laid out her terms. The Sussexes could not be half in, half out. They could not pick and choose royal responsibilities while pursuing private commercial ventures. It was either full service or full separation. Harry chose separation. They relinquished their HRH titles, gave up public funding, and relocated to Canada, then eventually California. At first, it seemed they would quietly build their life outside the royal bubble. But what followed defied every expectation. They launched Archewell, signed deals with Netflix and Spotify, sat down for a seismic interview with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, where they made damning claims about the royal family, including allegations that a senior royal had questioned the skin color of their unborn child. Meghan spoke of suicidal thoughts. Harry spoke of feeling trapped. That interview broke whatever remnants of trust remained. For the institution, this was not just damaging, it was dangerous. The monarchy is built on image, on unspoken rules, and the illusion of unity. The Sussexes had shattered that illusion. And with every project, every interview, they drove the wedge deeper. The memoir Spare, released in 2023, was the final nail. In it, Harry recounted fights with William, criticized Camilla, and accused the palace of leaking stories to protect others while sacrificing him and Meghan. He wrote of taking psychedelics to deal with trauma, of feeling like an outsider in his own family, and of resenting the role he never asked for. It was raw, it was revealing, and it was unforgivable in royal eyes. By now, Harry's position in the family was untenable. While he technically remained in the line of succession, he had become what insiders described as a symbolic threat. A prince who rejected the crown, yet retained its privileges. A duke who used his title to build a global platform while tearing down the very system that gave it to him. And so, discussions began. Within royal circles, questions about his removal from the line of succession were no longer theoretical. They became strategic. Could the monarchy survive another decade of Harry's public revelations? What would happen if Charles passed and Harry, still in the succession, became the subject of a constitutional crisis? How could they protect the throne from a man who had so openly distanced himself from it? Those questions didn't have easy answers. But one truth became increasingly clear. If Harry was going to continue acting as an outsider, then the institution would have to make that position official. What few knew then was that King Charles wasn't going to make that decision alone. He would seek the counsel of tradition, turning to those who had served the crown longer than Harry had been alive. The 24 hereditary dukes, ancient, politically dormant, but symbolically powerful, were brought into the fold. Their consensus would give the move legitimacy, and once their support was secured, the wheels were set in motion. But before any of that happened, before the paperwork, before the announcement, before the heartbreak, there was this moment, this chapter. The moment when Prince Harry, once beloved and celebrated, became a rogue duke. And in that moment, the monarchy turned, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with cold, quiet resolve. The prince had chosen his path. Now the crown was choosing theirs. In the world of royalty, power is rarely exercised through outright confrontation. The monarchy doesn't shout, it whispers. It moves not with fury, but with calculated silence. And as Prince Harry drifted further from the royal center, those whispers began to shape not just public opinion, but internal policy. Behind gilded doors and beneath ancient crests, a quiet but merciless campaign had begun, not to destroy the Duke of Sussex, but to erase the idea of his return. It didn't start with declarations or ultimatums. It began as a question, soft-spoken and loaded with centuries of inherited strategy. Is he still one of us? And once that question was asked, it spread like fire across the marble halls of the palace, the echo chambers of aristocratic clubs, and the hallowed corridors of the House of Lords. Because in the royal family, doubt is a weapon. This was the beginning of what insiders now call the Royal Whisper campaign. The timing was crucial. It unfolded in the months following the Oprah interview and intensified after the release of Harry's memoir. Within the palace, aides, senior courtiers, and advisors understood something the public had yet to fully grasp. Harry wasn't just hurting his family. He was endangering the monarchy's survival. The monarchy, after all, is not merely a family institution. It is a constitutional cornerstone, a cultural brand, and, to many, a sacred symbol. Harry's decision to weaponize his story, however heartfelt it may have been, was perceived as the ultimate betrayal. And in a world that runs on discretion, his very public outbursts created unease that was nearly impossible to contain. Thus, instead of launching a formal campaign of discipline, the palace employed its most enduring tactic, quiet marginalization. The strategy was simple: say nothing publicly, but subtly shift the narrative from within. It began with conversations between trusted advisors and select members of the media. No official statements were made, but stories began to change in tone. Headlines grew sharper. Language became colder. Terms like disgraced, estranged, and outsider began to replace beloved, spare, or hero prince. Royal reporters, who had once been sympathetic to Harry's struggles with the press, found themselves re-evaluating the narrative. Some were quietly briefed, off the record, naturally, about private incidents involving Harry and Meghan that painted them as difficult, ungrateful, and, most importantly, self-interested. And so, a new narrative began to solidify. Harry wasn't a victim. He was a threat. Internally, meetings grew more frequent among Charles's top advisors. Questions that had once seemed extreme were now viewed as logical contingencies. What if Harry continued releasing memoirs? What if he sold more private stories? What if legal action was taken by the couple against the monarchy itself? How long could the institution afford to play the role of silent bystander? The Whisper campaign evolved. Subtle gestures told the story. Harry and Meghan were seated further away from senior royals during the Platinum Jubilee. The Queen's funeral procession, while dignified, featured their names with less prominence in official programs. Certain ceremonial invitations, once assumed, were now quietly omitted. And when Harry publicly expressed a desire to reconcile, to find peace, there was no palace reply. Because by now, reconciliation wasn't the plan. Isolation was. Sources within the palace began referring to Harry in professional contexts not by his title, but as the former working royal. A subtle demotion. Even internal documents reportedly began to refer to the Sussexes as non-aligned entities. It wasn't a smear, it was distancing. And it was effective. But perhaps the most chilling part of the campaign came not from aides or advisors, but from those closest to the throne, family members themselves. Princess Anne, known for her blunt candor, is said to have questioned privately why Harry was still in the line of succession when he had no intention of ever returning. Prince Edward, always loyal to the crown, reportedly voiced concern that Harry's media ventures were becoming more damaging than helpful. Even Queen Camilla, according to palace sources, began pressing Charles to make a permanent decision, to cut ties before the monarchy's image was further compromised. And then there was William. Their rift was no longer deniable, no longer speculative. It was a reality, cold and hard as the stone walls of Windsor. William, future king and guardian of the crown, had stopped defending his brother long ago. Now, he was the most vocal supporter of a total break. William didn't need to speak publicly. His absence in every story involving Harry said enough. No shared statements. No sibling engagements. No private reunions captured by paparazzi. Where once there had been banter and brotherhood, now there was silence. And behind that silence was something sharper, a firm belief that Harry had gone too far. The Whisper campaign was not just about discrediting Harry. It was about preparing the public, the press, and the peers of the realm for what was coming, his removal. And in many ways, the campaign succeeded before the official decision was ever made. Polls taken during this period showed a sharp decline in public support for Harry and Meghan among the British public. Trust in the monarchy, while still strained, began to stabilize as the firm was seen as more dignified, more composed. Meghan's brand deals started to falter. Spotify dropped their high-profile deal. Netflix scaled back expectations. And the couple, once the darlings of progressive rebellion, now appeared adrift. No longer royal, no longer revolutionary, just controversial. And yet, Harry didn't seem to realize the full extent of the isolation campaign until it was too late. He gave interviews calling for reconciliation. He appeared on talk shows referencing his father and brother with a mix of longing and frustration. He made appearances at charity events where he spoke about forgiveness and healing. But the replies never came, because the decision had already been made, at least in spirit. It was during this time that King Charles, increasingly pressured to act, began consulting constitutional advisors on what options were available. Could a royal be legally removed from the line of succession without parliamentary action? Could titles be revoked without a public scandal? How would the dukes respond? This was the final phase of the Whisper campaign, transition to action. And yet, it was done with the same eerie silence. No royal correspondent broke the story early. No leaks reached tabloids until the decision was already final. That's how controlled, how surgical the campaign had become. When the letter finally arrived at Harry's doorstep, it wasn't loud. It didn't come with a press release or television announcement. It came with the same quiet chill that had followed him since the day he walked away from the palace gates. A royal seal, a folded document, a decision signed, stamped, and irreversible. He wasn't just being pushed out. He had already been left behind. The campaign had done its work. And now, the world would learn just how far the monarchy was willing to go to protect itself from its own blood. Long before the news broke, before Prince Harry's name vanished from the official royal succession list, before that letter arrived at his doorstep like a guillotine dressed in royal seal, the decision was already in motion. Not in the public court of opinion, but behind ancient oak doors, in a space few ever enter, among a group whose influence stretches deep into the veins of Britain's oldest traditions. These were not modern politicians, not palace staff or celebrity strategists. These were dukes, the 24 hereditary guardians of a fading empire, summoned for one of the most consequential and secretive consultations of the modern monarchy. It was, in many ways, a return to the old ways. When the crown felt threatened, it didn't issue tweets or schedule press conferences. It convened power, real power, not the type that screamed, but the type that moved mountains silently. And in the face of Prince Harry's relentless independence and his public grievances, King Charles knew he needed more than just advisors. He needed legitimacy. He needed the counsel of the ancient peerage. The idea of bringing in the 24 hereditary dukes wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. These were men whose titles predated modern democracy, whose families had stood alongside monarchs since the Plantagenets. Many of them no longer held political office, but they wielded influence in elite legal circles, in aristocratic networks, in the unwritten codes of Upper Britain. They were, quite literally, the last line of defense for the old order. The meeting location was as discreet as it was iconic, a private hall on the royal Sandringham estate. Not the main palace, not a room with public access. A place built for discretion, insulated by history and hedges. They arrived in staggered order, under the guise of a traditional hereditary peer consultation. Something the media wouldn't question too deeply. Inside, however, the conversation was anything but routine. What took place in that room remains unrecorded in any official documents. No cameras, no transcripts, just whispered accounts from insiders, pieced together over time. But one thing became clear. The 24 were not divided. According to reports from multiple sources close to those involved, King Charles opened the session with a single question: what becomes of the crown if we do nothing? It wasn't rhetorical. It was a provocation. A call for perspective from men trained to protect legacy over comfort. For hours, they spoke. Some argued that Harry's removal was overdue, that the monarchy had allowed too much leeway for too long. They referenced not only his Netflix deals and explosive interviews, but the subtle erosion of royal authority his actions had encouraged. They cited public opinion surveys, declining confidence in the firm among younger generations, and the risk of setting precedent that others in the family might one day use their titles to build media empires while criticizing the very system that granted them power. Others took a more cautious stance. What would the political ramifications be? Would this invite constitutional challenge? Could this ignite a public backlash from international fans who viewed Harry as a victim of royal rigidity? But ultimately, all roads led back to one truth. The monarchy cannot survive without control. And a prince, any prince, who operates beyond that control is not an asset. He's a liability. The legal logistics of such a move were discussed in detail. The line of succession, as protected by the Act of Settlement 1701 and reaffirmed by the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, was not something easily altered. Removing someone from it required more than royal displeasure. It required careful, constitutional maneuvering. That's where the dukes came in. Their influence, though not legislative in the traditional sense, granted the monarch political weight in matters of succession and royal law. If they agreed, if they supported the motion, it could be presented not as personal retaliation, but as a consensus for the good of the realm. And so, they were asked to do something no group had done in generations: endorse the formal removal of a living, legitimate royal from the succession line. The vote wasn't public. It wasn't written. But when King Charles stood at the end of that meeting, the silence spoke volumes. Not one duke objected. Not one urged restraint. The decision was sealed. What followed was weeks of procedural planning. Documents had to be drafted with absolute precision. The Privy Council had to be informed, though not asked for permission. Legal scholars from Oxford and Cambridge, discreet, fiercely loyal to the crown, were called to vet every word. The justification? That Prince Harry had irrevocably separated himself from the institution through his actions and intent, and therefore posed a constitutional risk should the line of succession ever be triggered unexpectedly. There was no rush to deliver the news. This was a slow, surgical operation, meticulous and merciless. The goal was not to humiliate Harry. It was to formalize what had already become apparent. He was no longer part of the royal future. During this time, Harry had no knowledge of the secret meetings. He continued with public engagements, occasionally referencing his hope for peace, his wish for reconciliation. He spoke of trauma, of healing, of still loving his family. In those words, some saw vulnerability. Others saw strategy. But to the inner circle surrounding King Charles, those words no longer carried weight. The decision had been made in a room he would never enter. And then, in the final week of preparation, came the final step, the drafting of the letter. This was not a standard palace memo. It was a legally binding communication, signed by the sovereign, drafted with constitutional caution, and delivered under royal seal. It did not accuse. It did not punish. It simply stated that Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, was no longer recognized within the official succession list of the United Kingdom and its realms. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of exile, tidy, quiet, absolute. And yet, behind its measured tone lay centuries of judgment. The letter, when it arrived, landed like a stone in still water. Not just for Harry, but for those closest to him. Meghan, reportedly, reacted with stunned fury. Close friends claimed she paced for hours, calling legal contacts, demanding answers, insisting it was unconstitutional. But the monarchy had prepared for this. The paperwork was airtight. In Montecito, Harry sat alone with the document in his hands. It didn't scold. It didn't rage. It simply erased. What had been decided in silence now rang loudly in his ears. The titles, the bloodline, the memories. None of it had stopped what had just happened. The institution had spoken, and for all his efforts to chart his own path, for all his pleas and protestations, he had underestimated one truth. The monarchy does not forget. It waits. It watches. And when it moves, it does so with devastating finality. This chapter of his life, the one shaped by palaces, parades, and protocol, was no longer his to edit. The 24 had spoken. The crown had ruled. And the prince, once poised to inherit centuries of tradition, was now a man adrift, stripped not by scandal, but by decision. After the Sandringham summit and the finalization of his separation from royal duties, Prince Harry knew that the door he had closed behind him might never reopen. Yet, deep in his heart, he held on to something more stubborn than certainty: hope. Hope that one day, bridges would be rebuilt. That time would dull the sharp edges of hurt. That his family, no matter how cold they had become, might still understand. And in the weeks leading up to what would become the final blow, his formal removal from the royal succession list, Harry tried once more to reach them. Not through interviews, not through statements to the press, but with something far more personal, far more vulnerable: letters. Prince William issued an ultimatum. Sources close to the situation say the meeting took place at Windsor Castle, in a private chamber used for confidential discussions between senior royals. Present were King Charles III, Queen Camilla, and William. No aides, no advisors, just blood and power. William spoke with restraint, but his message was unflinching. He reportedly told his father, "He cannot be both an enemy of the institution and a part of its future." The words, while simple, carried centuries of royal consequence. What William was demanding was clear: that Prince Harry be formally and permanently removed from the line of succession. That the crown take a stand, not for punishment, but for preservation. King Charles, reportedly torn, listened without interrupting. He had long tried to maintain a delicate balance between his sons. He loved them both, in his own quiet way. But the damage Harry had done, intentional or not, could no longer be denied. And now, his heir, his successor, was drawing a line in the sand. William was not asking. He was insisting. Behind the fury in that moment lay years of betrayal, at least from William's perspective. He had always carried the greater burden. From childhood, he had been groomed for duty, watched more closely, judged more harshly. Harry, by contrast, had been freer, looser, less encumbered by expectation. William had tolerated that. But when Harry turned his back on the family and then began airing its secrets for profit, that tolerance turned into quiet rage. Even the public didn't see the full extent of William's fury. In official appearances, he maintained his composure. He smiled. He waved. But insiders noted a shift, a harder edge, a less forgiving tone, especially when questions of reconciliation were raised by journalists. William, once known for his warmth, had become cold and distant when Harry's name surfaced. That, more than anything, told the story. He hadn't just lost a brother. He had declared him a threat. And in the language of royalty, threats are not ignored. They are neutralized. It was said that William believed allowing Harry to remain in the succession posed a constitutional risk. What if something happened to Charles and William in quick succession? Would Harry, a man now living permanently in the United States, who had publicly attacked the monarchy, be next in line? Would the crown truly allow a man who had described his own family as cold and manipulative to one day hold any residual authority? To William, the very idea was intolerable. And so, his ultimatum was strategic. It placed the full weight of future leadership behind the decision to remove Harry. If Charles hesitated, he now had pressure from both the hereditary dukes and his own heir. This was not just a family decision anymore. This was about the monarchy's future, about stability, image, continuity. According to one source within Clarence House, the meeting ended not with a handshake, but with a silence that carried more finality than words ever could. William left first. Camilla followed. Charles remained seated, unmoving for nearly 20 minutes. Days later, the legal mechanisms for removing Harry from the succession began moving forward. In public, the palace remained mute. No statement, no leak, no headline. But inside royal circles, the message had been sent and received. William's position was now clear, his influence undeniable. But what's perhaps most tragic is that none of this was inevitable. There was a time when William and Harry had been inseparable, when they leaned on each other during the darkest days of their lives, when they walked side by side behind their mother's coffin, when they stood as best man at each other's weddings. They were more than brothers. They were each other's protection. But the world they were born into was not built to sustain closeness. The roles were too different. The expectations too divergent. One would be king, the other forever in his shadow. Still, William had hoped, or so friends say, that they would find a way to balance those roles. That Harry, in time, would accept his position and use it to support the crown. Instead, Harry rejected the system outright. And in doing so, he forced William to make a choice he never wanted to make. Brother or heir? He chose heir. And the consequences were irreversible. It was William's fury, controlled, channeled, but utterly unrelenting, that solidified Harry's fate. His ultimatum turned a private estrangement into a constitutional necessity. And once the machinery of monarchy began turning, there was no stopping it. Harry had lit the fire, but it was William who made sure there was no going back.